The first rays of dawn painted the horizon in hues of pink and gold as Clara Stevens arranged the freshly cut wildflowers in tin buckets outside her modest wooden stand. The year was 1876, and Mineral Point, Wisconsin, was slowly stirring to life. The small mining town had seen better days since its lead mining boom in the 1830s, but it still maintained a certain rustic charm that Clara had grown to love, despite the hardships she faced daily. Clara, now 22, had been selling flowers for nearly 3 years, ever since her father had passed away in a mining accident. The garden behind their small cottage had once been her mother's pride and joy, a place of solace and beauty. Now it was their livelihood. Her mother, Clara Stevens, had fallen ill with consumption shortly after her husband's death, leaving Clara to become both caretaker and breadwinner. "These daisies are looking particularly lovely today," Clara murmured to herself, adjusting a particularly stubborn bloom. Her honey-brown hair was pulled back into a practical bun, though a few tendrils had escaped to frame her face. Her calico dress was faded but clean, meticulously patched in several places. The street began to fill with the usual morning traffic, miners heading to work, shopkeepers opening their establishments, and ladies going about their morning errands. Clara smiled and nodded politely at the familiar faces, though few stopped to purchase her flowers. It was the end of May, and while her garden was in full bloom, most townsfolk considered flowers an unnecessary luxury. She sighed softly, mentally calculating how many bouquets she would need to sell today to afford her mother's medicine. Dr. Wilson had been kind enough to extend credit, but his patience wouldn't last forever. Clara needed at least $2 by week's end, and so far, she had only managed to save 75 cents. The clatter of hooves against the packed dirt road drew her attention. A horse-drawn wagon she didn't recognize was making its way down Main Street, followed by several riders on horseback. Newcomers weren't uncommon in Mineral Point, but they always brought a flutter of curiosity to the small town. Clara straightened her posture and put on her most welcoming smile as the wagon slowed near her stand. The driver, a middle-aged man with a salt and pepper beard, tipped his hat to her but continued past. 2 of the riders followed, but the third, a tall man on a magnificent chestnut stallion, reined his horse to a stop before her. "Good morning, miss," he said, his voice deep and pleasant as he dismounted with the easy grace of someone who'd spent his life in the saddle. "Those are some fine flowers you have there." Clara's breath caught in her throat. The stranger stood over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and sun-bronzed skin that spoke of long days under the open sky. His dark hair curled slightly beneath his wide-brimmed hat, and his eyes were the color of a summer storm gray with hints of blue. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense. His nose had clearly been broken at least once, and there was a small scar near his right eye. But there was something compelling about his face, a combination of strength and kindness that made it difficult for Clara to look away. "Thank you, sir," she managed, finding her voice. "Would you care to buy a bouquet? The lilacs are especially fragrant this morning." The man studied the flowers with genuine interest, then looked back at Clara. His gaze was direct but not unkind. "What's your name, miss?" he asked. "Clara Stevens," she replied, a bit surprised by the question. "Miss Stevens," he nodded, as if committing it to memory. "I'm Grant Mitchell. Just arrived from Montana Territory." Montana. Clara had heard tales of the Western Territory's wild, untamed lands where fortunes could be made and lost in the blink of an eye. Men like Grant Mitchell, with their weathered faces and quiet confidence, embodied those stories. "What brings you to Mineral Point, Mr. Mitchell?" Clara asked, curiosity getting the better of her usual reserve. "Business, mostly," he replied, picking up a bunch of purple cannella flowers. "My uncle left me some property here. I've come to see about selling it." Clara nodded, trying not to show her disappointment. "Just another visitor passing through, then. How much for these?" he asked, indicating the flowers in his hand. 5 cents, Clara said. Grant reached into his pocket and pulled out a coin, placing it in her palm. His fingers brushed against hers, rough and calloused but surprisingly gentle. "Thank you," Clara said, wrapping the stems in a piece of dampened newspaper. Instead of taking the bouquet, Grant turned to survey the rest of her modest display. "You grew all of these yourself," Clara nodded. "Yes, in the garden behind our house. My mother started it years ago, but she's not well enough to tend it anymore." Something flickered in Grant's eyes, understanding, perhaps, or sympathy. "That's a mighty impressive garden, then. You must have quite the green thumb." Clara felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. "It's nothing special, really. Just wildflowers mostly, and a few cultivated varieties that my mother favored." Grant stepped closer to the buckets of flowers, examining each variety with careful attention. "I'd say it's plenty special. Back in Montana, flowers like these are a rare sight indeed." A comfortable silence settled between them as he continued to study her wares. Clara found herself watching the way the morning light played across his features, highlighting the crinkles at the corners of his eyes that appeared when he smiled at a particularly vibrant bloom. "How much would it cost to buy all of them?" Grant asked suddenly. Clara blinked in surprise. "All of them? Sir, I couldn't possibly. I'm serious, Miss Stevens," Grant said, his expression earnest. "Name your price." Clara's mind raced. All of her flowers. That would mean no need to stand here all day hoping for customers. She could return home to care for her mother and perhaps even start on tomorrow's bouquets. But what would this stranger want with so many flowers? "May I ask why you would need so many?" she inquired cautiously. A slight smile tugged at the corner of Grant's mouth. "Let's just say I've been on the trail for quite some time, and I've forgotten how nice it is to be surrounded by beautiful things." There was something in the way he looked at her as he said this that made Clara's heart beat a little faster. She glanced down, fiddling with her apron. "Well," she said, quickly calculating, "if you were to buy everything I have here today, it would normally sell for about $1.50 if I were fortunate enough to sell it all." Grant nodded thoughtfully, then reached into his vest pocket and pulled out 2 gold dollar coins. "How about $2? Seems only fair, considering I'm buying you out of stock." Clara stared at the coins in disbelief. $2 was more than she sometimes made in an entire week. It would cover her mother's medicine with money to spare for food and perhaps even a bit of beef for a hearty stew. "Mr. Mitchell, that's very generous, but please," he interrupted gently. "I insist." He placed the coins in her hand, closing her fingers over them with his own. "Consider it a welcome gift to myself." Clara looked up at him, studying his face for any sign of ulterior motive, but found only sincerity. "Thank you," she said finally, tucking the coins safely into her pocket. "What would you like me to do with the flowers?" "I could help you carry them to wherever you're staying." Grant glanced down the street toward where his companions had stopped, then back at Clara. "Actually, I have a better idea. Why don't you keep them here and continue selling them? I don't really have a place for them yet anyway. I've paid for the pleasure of knowing they exist, and that's enough for me." Clara couldn't hide her confusion. "But they're yours now. I can't sell what isn't mine." Grant's smile widened, revealing straight white teeth. "Consider yourself my business partner for the day, then. Whatever you make from selling them is yours to keep as well." Before Clara could protest further, a shout came from down the street. One of Grant's companions was waving him over. "Duty calls," Grant said, picking up the single bouquet of coneflowers he'd first selected. "I hope to see you again, Miss Stevens." "Likewise, Mr. Mitchell," Clara replied, finding that she truly meant it. With a tip of his hat, Grant mounted his horse and rode to join his friends, leaving Clara standing amid her flowers, 2 gold coins in her pocket, and a curious warmth spreading through her chest. The following morning, Clara returned to her spot with fresh flowers from her garden. Her mother had been delighted by the unexpected income the previous day, though the effort of excitement had brought on a coughing spell that left her weaker than usual. Clara had spent the evening making a nourishing broth and picking the finest blooms for today's sales. wondering all the while if she would see the tall cowboy again. As the morning progressed with no sign of Grant Mitchell, Clara tried to quell her disappointment. It was foolish to expect anything more from a chance encounter with a passing stranger, no matter how kind his eyes or generous his gesture. By midday, she had sold several bouquets to regular customers who seemed more inclined to stop now that her stand was flourishing with fresh blooms. Mrs. Baker, the banker's wife, even commented on how vibrant Clara looked today. "There's a glow about you, dear," the older woman said with a knowing smile. "Is there a young man I should know about?" Clara laughed off the suggestion, but felt her cheeks grow warm. "No, Mrs. Baker. Just happy to have a good day of sales." As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows, Clara was preparing to pack up when she spotted a familiar figure striding purposefully down the street. Grant Mitchell had traded his travel-worn clothes for a clean white shirt and dark vest, though he still wore the same wide-brimmed hat. He carried a small parcel under one arm. "Miss Stevens," he called as he approached, a smile lighting his face. "I was hoping I'd catch you before you left." Clara couldn't help returning his smile. "Mr. Mitchell, how nice to see you again." "I trust you had a good day," he asked, gesturing to her nearly empty buckets. "Very good, thank you. Your generosity yesterday allowed me to bring even more flowers today," Grant nodded, seemingly pleased. "I'm glad to hear it." He shifted the parcel in his arms. "I was wondering if I might ask for another favor." "Of course," Clara replied, curious. "I'd like to purchase today's remaining flowers as well," he said, "and if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to see this garden of yours." Clara hesitated. Inviting a man she'd just met to her home wasn't exactly proper, even in the relatively relaxed social atmosphere of Mineral Point. Yet something about Grant Mitchell made her trust him instinctively. "My mother is at home," she said finally. "I'm sure she would be pleased to meet the gentleman who's taken such an interest in her flowers." Grant's smile widened. "I'd be honored to meet her." Clara quickly gathered her remaining flowers and the empty buckets. Grant immediately stepped forward to help, taking the heavier items despite her protests. "Please, allow me," he insisted. "My mother would turn in her grave if she knew I'd let a lady carry such burdens when I had two good arms to offer." The walk to Clara's home took them through the winding streets of Mineral Point, past limestone cottages built by the Cornish miners who had settled the area decades earlier. Clara's home was on the outskirts of town, a small wooden structure with a slate roof and a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. Despite its modest appearance, the yard was a riot of color, with flower beds extending from the front of the house all the way around to the back. Grant whistled appreciatively as they approached. "You weren't exaggerating about your garden. It's magnificent." Clara felt a surge of pride. The garden had always been special to her family, but hearing it praised by someone else, especially someone who had presumably seen much grander sights, was deeply gratifying. "Thank you. It's been in our family for 3 generations now. My grandmother started it, then my mother expanded it, and now I tend it." As they reached the front door, Clara paused. "Mr. Mitchell, I should warn you, my mother's illness, it's consumption. The doctor says it's not highly contagious in her case, but I'm not worried," Grant interrupted gently. "My sister had the same illness. I nursed her through it myself." Clara studied his face, noting the flicker of old pain in his eyes. "I'm sorry." Grant nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy without dwelling on it. "Shall we go in?" Clara Stevens was sitting in a rocking chair near the window when Clara entered with Grant. Despite her illness, Clara maintained a dignified appearance, her silver-streaked hair neatly braided and her thin frame wrapped in a faded but clean shawl. "Mother," Clara said, setting down her buckets, "we have a visitor. This is Mr. Grant Mitchell. He's the gentleman I told you about, the one who purchased all our flowers yesterday." Alina's pale blue eyes, so like her daughter's, lit up with interest. "Mr. Mitchell, what a pleasure. Please come in and sit down. Clara, dear, would you fetch some tea?" "There's no need to trouble yourself, Mrs. Stevens," Grant said. but Clara was already moving toward the kitchen, grateful for the chance to gather her thoughts. As she prepared the tea, she could hear the low murmur of conversation from the front room. Grant's deep voice complemented her mother's softer tones, and occasional laughter suggested they were getting along well. Clara found herself smiling as she arranged cookies on a plate, the last of their sugar, but worth it for such a special occasion. When she returned with the tea tray, she found Grant sitting across from her mother, the parcel he'd brought now open on the small table between them. Inside was a book, a beautifully bound volume with gilded edges. "Ah, Clara," Eleanor said, her cheeks flushed with more color than Clara had seen in weeks. "Mr. Mitchell was just telling me about his travels. Did you know he's been all the way to California? And look at this wonderful book he's brought, Poetry by Alfred Lord Tennyson." Grant looked up as Clara set the tea tray down. "Your mother tells me you're fond of reading, Miss Stevens." Clara nodded, pouring the tea into their best cups, the ones with only a single chip each. "When there's time, yes, though books are something of a luxury these days." "Not at all," Grant said. "Books are a necessity. They feed the mind just as surely as bread feeds the body." He accepted the cup Clara offered him with a nod of thanks. "I've always carried a few volumes with me, even when traveling light. This one has been a particular comfort on lonely nights." Clara sat down next to her mother, cradling her own teacup. "Do you have a favorite poem, Mr. Mitchell?" Grant considered the question thoughtfully. "Ulysses, perhaps. There's something about the idea of continuing to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield that speaks to me." He smiled slightly. "Though I'm also partial to the Lady of Shalott, there's a musicality to it that reminds me of my mother. She used to sing old ballads while she worked." Eleanor's eyes brightened. "Oh, I adored that poem in my youth. Clara, would you fetch my small box from the bedroom?" "The one with my keepsakes?" While Clara was gone, she could hear Grant asking her mother about the garden, how long it had been established, which flowers thrived best in the Wisconsin soil, and how they had learned to cultivate such variety. By the time she returned with the wooden box, her mother was animatedly describing the techniques her own mother had taught her for propagating roses. "Here it is, Mother," Clara said, placing the box in Eleanor's lap. With trembling fingers, Eleanor opened the box and withdrew a faded piece of paper, carefully unfolding it to reveal a pressed flower, a perfect white rose, its form miraculously preserved despite the years. "My husband gave me this on the day Clara was born," Eleanor explained, a soft smile on her lips. "It was the first rose to bloom in our garden that spring. He said it reminded him of me, strong enough to bloom after a harsh winter." Grant leaned forward to look at the delicate blossom, his expression reverent. "It's beautiful. And he was right, there's something miraculous about the first bloom of spring." Eleanor carefully refolded the paper and returned it to the box. "Clara has her father's gift with growing things. The garden has flourished under her care, even as I've been unable to tend it." "Mother," Clara protested gently, but Eleanor shook her head. "It's true, dear. You've surpassed even my best efforts." She turned back to Grant. "She's up before dawn every day, weeding and watering before heading to town to sell what she's grown. And then she comes home to care for a sick old woman." "You're hardly old, Mrs. Stevens," Grant said with a warm smile, "and it's clear where your daughter gets her strength and grace." Clara felt her cheeks flush at the compliment, indirect though it was. She busied herself with refilling teacups to hide her reaction. The conversation flowed easily as they finished their tea. Grant spoke of his ranch in Montana, the cattle he raised, and the small town that had sprung up near his land. He described mountains that touched the clouds and valleys so green they seemed like emeralds set into the earth. His words painted pictures so vivid that Clara could almost see the vast landscapes he described. As the afternoon light began to wane, Grant reluctantly stood. "I've imposed on your hospitality long enough, Mrs. Stevens. Thank you for the tea and the delightful conversation." "It was our pleasure, Mr. Mitchell," Eleanor replied, her eyes twinkling. "I do hope you'll visit again before you leave Mineral Point. I certainly will, Grant said, his gaze shifting to Clara. If that's agreeable to you both. Clara nodded, perhaps a bit too quickly. Of course. You're welcome anytime. In that case, Grant continued, I was wondering if I might call on you tomorrow, Miss Stevens. There's a matter I'd like to discuss regarding your flowers. Clara exchanged a quick glance with her mother, who gave an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. I would be happy to receive you, Mr. Mitchell. Excellent, Grant smiled, gathering his hat. Until tomorrow, then. Good day, Mrs. Stevens, Miss Stevens. After seeing him to the door, Clara returned to find her mother watching her with a knowing expression. Well, Alina said, he's certainly not what I expected when you told me about the cowboy who bought all your flowers. Clara began gathering the teacups. What do you mean? He's educated, for one thing. Did you hear him quote Tennyson? And he has manners that would put some of our local gentlemen to shame. Alina's eyes softened. He also looks at you as if you hung the moon and stars, my dear. Mother, Clara protested, nearly dropping a cup. He does not. We've only just met. Alina laughed softly, which turned into a slight cough. Sometimes that's all it takes. Your father proposed to me after knowing me for just 2 weeks. Clara shook her head but couldn't suppress her smile. You're imagining things. Mr. Mitchell is simply a kind man who appreciates flowers. Alina hummed, unconvinced. I suppose we'll see tomorrow what sort of matter he wishes to discuss with you. As Clara carried the tea tray back to the kitchen, she tried to temper the flutter of excitement in her chest. It wouldn't do to read too much into Grant's visit, or his invitation to call on her again. Men like him, educated, worldly, successful, didn't typically form attachments to women like her, women whose lives were circumscribed by duty and necessity. And yet, as she prepared dinner and helped her mother to bed, Clara found herself remembering the way Grant's eyes had crinkled when he smiled, the gentle timbre of his voice as he read a stanza from The Lady of Shalott, and the careful attention he paid to her mother's stories. Despite her best efforts at pragmatism, she fell asleep that night with a smile on her lips and the faint scent of canneflowers drifting through her open window. Grant arrived promptly at 10 o'clock the following morning. Clara had been up since dawn, tending the garden with particular care and changing her dress twice, before settling on her best one, a blue calico that her mother insisted brought out the color of her eyes. Alina had teasingly accused her of primping like a debutante, but Clara had simply kissed her mother's cheek and reminded her to rest while she was gone. When she opened the door to find Grant standing on the porch, hat in hand and freshly shaved, Clara's breath caught in her throat. In the clear morning light, he looked even more handsome than she remembered. Good morning, Miss Stevens, he greeted her, his smile warm. I hope I'm not calling too early. Not at all, Mr. Mitchell, Clara replied, stepping onto the porch and closing the door behind her. Mother is resting, but she sends her regards. Grant nodded. Please give her mine as well. I thought perhaps we might walk a bit if that's agreeable to you. The matter I wish to discuss might be better addressed outdoors. Clara's curiosity was piqued, but she merely nodded and fell into step beside him as they headed down the path that led from her house toward a small creek that ran along the edge of their property. Your garden truly is exceptional, Grant commented as they walked. I've never seen such variety, not even in San Francisco. You've been to San Francisco? Clara asked, intrigued. She had read about the bustling coastal city but never imagined visiting it herself. Grant nodded. Several times. I drove cattle to the railhead at Cheyenne, then took the train west. It's an impressive city, always changing, always building, but I prefer the open spaces of Montana, truth be told. It sounds wonderful, Clara said, trying to picture the vast ranch he had described the day before. So different from Mineral Point. Different, yes, but not necessarily better, Grant replied thoughtfully. There's something to be said for established communities, for homes that have stood for generations. He glanced at her. For gardens tended by the same family for decades. They reached the creek, where a fallen log provided a natural bench overlooking the water. Grant gestured for Clara to sit, then joined her, maintaining a respectful distance. "Miss Stevens, Clara, if I may," he began, his tone becoming more serious. "I've come to a decision about my uncle's property." Clara looked at him expectantly, unsure how this related to her flowers. "The land includes a small house on the edge of town and about 20 acres surrounding it," Grant continued. "It's good land, fertile with a spring-fed pond. My original intention was to sell it quickly and return to Montana." "And now," Clara prompted when he paused. Grant turned to face her more directly. "Now I'm considering staying in Mineral Point at least for a while, and I have a proposition for you." Clara's heart began to beat faster, though she wasn't sure why. "What sort of proposition?" "A business arrangement," Grant said. "The land is perfect for expanding your flower operation. With 20 acres, you could grow far more than your current garden allows. There's even a small greenhouse that my uncle built years ago. It needs some repairs, but it's structurally sound." Clara blinked in surprise. "You want me to grow flowers on your land?" "I want to invest in your talent," Grant corrected gently. "I believe there's a market for flowers beyond Mineral Point. The railroad makes shipping possible to Chicago, Milwaukee, even as far as St. Louis. With the right planning, you could build a thriving business." Clara's mind raced with the possibilities. A greenhouse would mean extending the growing season, perhaps even cultivating exotic varieties. And 20 acres. It was more land than she'd ever dreamed of having for her flowers. "But why?" she asked finally. "Why would you invest in me? You barely know me." Grant was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to the flowing creek. "My uncle was a businessman, Clara. He taught me to recognize opportunity when I see it, but more importantly, he taught me to trust my instincts about people." He looked back at her, his expression earnest. "I've met a lot of folks in my travels, and I've learned to spot genuine quality pretty quickly. You have it in spades." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. "That's very kind of you to say." "It's not kindness, it's honesty," Grant replied. "The way you care for your mother, the pride you take in your garden, the determination you show by standing on that street corner day after day, those things speak volumes about your character." Clara looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. The offer was tempting more than tempting. It was like a dream come true, but practical concerns quickly surfaced. "I couldn't leave my mother," she said. "She needs constant care, and our house, modest though it is, has been adapted for her comfort." Grant nodded, understanding. "I wouldn't expect you to. The house on the property could be used for storage or perhaps for hired help eventually. You and your mother would remain in your home." "And what would you gain from this arrangement?" Clara asked, still struggling to understand his motivation. "A partner," Grant said simply. "I'd provide the land and capital, you'd provide the expertise and labor. We'd split the profits. And I'd have a reason to divide my time between Montana and Wisconsin, which has increasingly seemed like an appealing prospect." There was something in the way he looked at her as he said this last part that made Clara wonder if there was more to his proposition than strict business. But she pushed the thought aside, focusing on the practical aspects. "It sounds wonderful, Mr. Mitchell, but I'm afraid I don't have the resources to begin such an enterprise, even with your generous offer of land." "Call me Grant, please," he said. "And as for resources, that's precisely what I'm offering to provide. Seeds, tools, labor for the larger tasks, whatever you need to get started. I have some savings set aside, and I believe this would be a sound investment." Clara stood and walked a few steps toward the creek, trying to process everything he was suggesting. It was an opportunity beyond anything she'd ever imagined possible, a chance not just to survive but to thrive, to turn her passion into a true vocation. And yet, "May I ask you something, Grant?" she said, turning back to him. He rose to join her. "Of course. Is this offer? Is it entirely business? Or is there another reason you wish to establish ties here in Mineral Point?" Grant's eyes softened, and for a moment he seemed almost vulnerable. "Would it complicate matters if I said I find myself reluctant to leave without knowing you better?" Clara's heart skipped a beat. It might, she admitted. I wouldn't want any business between us to be confused by other considerations. Grant took a step closer, though still maintaining a proper distance. Clara, I want to be completely transparent with you. Yes, I believe this flower business could be profitable. And yes, I also find myself drawn to you in a way I didn't expect, but the two aren't conditional upon each other. If you accept my business proposal but wish to keep our relationship strictly professional, I would respect that boundary absolutely. Clara studied his face, searching for any sign of insincerity but found only earnest openness. And if I declined the business proposal? Then I would still hope for the privilege of calling on you while I'm in town, Grant replied without hesitation. Though I understand that might be inappropriate without the context of a business relationship. Clara couldn't help but smile at his careful navigation of propriety. You're very considerate of my reputation, Mr. Mitchell. Grant, he reminded her gently. And yes, I am. It matters to me that you're treated with the respect you deserve. The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within Clara. It had been a long time since anyone had put her well-being first since before her father died, really. Since then, she had been the one caring for others, making sacrifices, shouldering burdens. The idea that someone wanted to lighten that load, to create opportunities rather than obstacles, was almost overwhelming. I need time to think, she said finally. It's a generous offer and I'm deeply flattered by your personal interest as well. But this isn't a decision I can make lightly, especially when it affects my mother's welfare too. Grant nodded, his expression understanding. Of course, take all the time you need. I'll be in Mineral Point for at least another week, possibly longer depending on how some other business matters progress. They walked back toward Clara's house in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they reached her front gate, Grant paused. Regardless of what you decide about the business proposal, he said, would you and your mother do me the honor of joining me for dinner tomorrow evening? The hotel has a private dining room and I've heard the cook is quite accomplished. Clara hesitated. Dining out was a rare luxury, and her mother hadn't been strong enough for such an outing in months. And yet, the hopeful look in Grant's eyes made her reluctant to refuse. That's very kind, she said, but I'm not sure if Mother is up to it. Perhaps you could join us here instead. I'm a decent cook, though nothing fancy. Grant's face lit up with a smile. I'd be delighted. What time would be convenient for you? 6 o'clock, Clara suggested. It gives Mother time to rest in the afternoon. 6 o'clock it is. Grant reached for her hand, raising it briefly to his lips in a gesture that was old-fashioned but oddly touching. Until tomorrow, Clara. As she watched him walk away, Clara pressed her fingers to the spot where his lips had touched, a flutter of excitement mingling with the practical considerations swirling in her mind. She had a lot to think about and a special dinner to prepare. Alina was delighted by the dinner invitation, though she tried to temper her obvious enthusiasm for Grant's company with maternal concern. Are you sure about this, Clara? She asked as they sat in the garden later that afternoon. He seems a good man, but we know so little about him. Clara continued weeding around the rose bushes, avoiding her mother's perceptive gaze. It's just dinner, Mother, and he's made it clear that his business proposal stands regardless of any personal feelings. Alina raised an eyebrow. Personal feelings, on his part or yours? Clara felt her cheeks grow warm. Mother, please, I'm trying to be sensible about this. Sensible is good, Alina agreed, adjusting the shawl around her shoulders despite the warm day. But don't be so sensible that you miss an opportunity for happiness. Those don't come along every day, you know. Clara sat back on her heels, wiping a smudge of dirt from her forehead. Do you think Father would approve of him? Alina's expression softened. Your father would have liked him very much, I think. Grant reminds me of him in some ways, that same quiet strength, that same respectful manner. She reached out to touch Clara's cheek. But what matters most is what you think of him, dear. Clara leaned into her mother's touch, grateful for her wisdom and support. I like him, she admitted quietly. More than I should, perhaps, after knowing him for such a short time. Elinor smiled. The heart knows what it knows, Clara. Sometimes it recognizes what the mind hasn't caught up to yet. With her mother's words echoing in her mind, Clara spent the rest of the day cleaning the house and preparing for their dinner guest. She baked bread, prepared her mother's recipe for chicken and dumplings, and even managed to find a few early strawberries in the garden for a simple dessert. By the time Grant arrived the following evening, bearing a bottle of wine and a small bouquet of wildflowers different from any in Clara's garden, both Stevens women were dressed in their Sunday best, and the small cottage was filled with the aroma of home cooking. "Something smells wonderful," Grant said as Clara welcomed him inside. He handed her the flowers with a smile. "I found these on my ride this morning and thought you might like to see varieties from further afield." Clara accepted the bouquet, touched by his thoughtfulness. "They're beautiful." "I don't recognize some of these, this purple one, for instance." "Prairie clover," Grant supplied. "It grows abundantly in the high plains. The Lakota use it for tea, I'm told." Elinor, seated in her usual chair by the window, brightened at this. "You're familiar with native plant uses, Mr. Mitchell?" Grant moved to greet her, bending to take her frail hand in his. "To some extent, Mrs. Stevens. I've learned what I could from the indigenous people I've encountered in my travels. Their knowledge of the land far exceeds anything in our botanical texts." This launched a conversation about medicinal plants that carried them through the first part of dinner. Clara found herself watching Grant's animated expressions as he described a Crow medicine man who had once treated him for fever with a concoction of herbs that tasted like the wrong end of a skunk, but worked better than any doctor's medicine. The dinner was a success, with Grant praising Clara's cooking so enthusiastically that she blushed. As they shared the strawberry shortcake Clara had prepared for dessert, Grant turned the conversation to his business proposal. "Have you had a chance to consider my offer, Clara?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes watchful. Clara glanced at her mother, who nodded encouragingly. "I have," she replied, "and I've discussed it with Mother as well." "I told her she'd be a fool to refuse," Elinor interjected with a twinkle in her eye. "Though I also said she should negotiate for a larger share of the profits." Grant laughed, a rich, warm sound that filled the small dining room. "A woman after my own heart, Mrs. Stevens. You're absolutely right to look out for your daughter's interests." Clara couldn't help but smile at the easy rapport between them. "What Mother means is that we'd like to accept your offer with perhaps a few modifications to discuss." Grant's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "That's wonderful news. I'm open to any modifications you think appropriate." "For instance," Clara continued, feeling more confident now that she'd made her decision, "I'd want to start small, perhaps just a few acres at first, and expand gradually as we learn what grows best and what sells most reliably." Grant nodded. "A prudent approach. What else?" "I'd need help with the physical labor. I can manage our current garden, but anything larger would require assistance." "Absolutely," Grant agreed. "I know several reliable men in town already who could be hired for the heavier work, and perhaps a woman to help with the cutting and arranging." Clara considered this. "Yes, that would be sensible, and regarding profits, I was thinking an even split," Grant said. 50-50, but I'm open to negotiation as Mrs. Stevens suggested." Clara exchanged a glance with her mother, who nodded slightly. 60-40, Clara proposed, her heart pounding at her own boldness. "With the larger share to me, as I'll be providing the daily oversight and expertise." Instead of being offended, Grant smiled appreciatively. "Done," he said without hesitation, "with one condition." Clara raised an eyebrow, suddenly wary. "What condition?" "That you'll allow me to build a proper greenhouse, larger than the existing one, before winter comes. I've seen designs in California that could extend your growing season considerably." Relief washed over Clara. "That seems more than fair, though I'd want to be consulted on the design." "Of course," Grant agreed readily. "It would be your domain, after all." As they continued discussing the details of their arrangement, Clara found herself increasingly excited by the possibilities. Grant had clearly given the matter considerable thought, suggesting potential markets, discussing transportation options, and even proposing they create a catalog for mail orders once they were established. "You've thought of everything," Clara said finally, impressed by his thoroughness. Grant's expression turned slightly sheepish. "Not quite everything. There's one matter we haven't addressed." "What's that?" Clara asked. "The name of our enterprise," Grant replied. "Every business needs a good name." Alina, who had been quietly listening to their discussion, spoke up. "Why not Stevens and Mitchell Florals? Simple, straightforward, with both your names represented." Grant considered this, then nodded. "I like it." "Clara?" Clara tested the name silently, finding she liked the way their names sounded together. "It's perfect," she agreed. As the evening drew to a close, Alina excused herself, claiming fatigue, though Clara suspected her mother was deliberately giving them a few moments alone. Grant helped Clara clear the dishes, insisting on drying as she washed. "I'm very pleased you've accepted my proposal," Grant said as they worked side by side in the small kitchen. "I think we'll make good partners." Clara glanced at him, noting the warmth in his eyes that suggested he might be speaking of more than just business. "I think so too," she replied softly. When the dishes were done, Grant reluctantly prepared to take his leave. At the door, he turned to Clara, taking both her hands in his. "I'd like to call on you again tomorrow, if I may," he said. "There's a spot on the property I think would be perfect for starting our first expanded beds." "I'd value your opinion." Clara nodded, acutely aware of the gentle pressure of his hands around hers. "I'd like that, say 10 o'clock again." "10 it is." Grant hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. For a heart-stopping moment, Clara thought he might kiss her, but he merely brushed his lips against her cheek, a gesture so light she might have imagined it. "Good night, Clara." "Good night, Grant," she whispered, watching as he walked down the path into the gathering dusk. When she closed the door and turned around, she found her mother watching from the hallway, a knowing smile on her face. "Not a word, Mother," Clara warned, though she couldn't keep the smile from her own lips. Alina raised her hands in mock surrender. "I wouldn't dream of it, dear. But if you're interested, I believe your grandmother's wedding dress is still in the trunk in the attic. It might need some alterations, of course." "Mother!" Clara exclaimed, but she was laughing as she helped the older woman to her bedroom, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. True to his word, Grant wasted no time in beginning work on the property. He hired local men to clear the first few acres for planting, repair fences, and begin restoration of the small house, which would serve initially as a workspace for processing and arranging flowers. Clara divided her time between caring for her mother, maintaining her existing garden, and working with Grant to plan the expanded operation. Each day brought new challenges and decisions, from selecting which varieties to plant first to designing the layout of the beds for maximum efficiency. Through it all, Grant was a steady, supportive presence. He deferred to Clara's expertise regarding the flowers themselves, but contributed valuable insights about business operations. They worked well together, their different strengths complementing each other in ways that surprised and delighted them both. As June gave way to July, their business partnership gradually evolved into something more personal. Grant began joining the Stevens women for dinner several times a week. He brought books for Alina and seeds from distant places for Clara. Sometimes, when the day's work was done, he and Clara would sit on her porch as twilight descended, talking about everything and nothing, their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Clara learned that Grant had lost both parents by the age of 16 and had been raised thereafter by his uncle. He had fought briefly in the Civil War, an experience he spoke of rarely and with obvious pain. He had headed west afterward, working as a cowhand before saving enough to buy his own land in Montana. There had been women in his past, he was forthright about that, but never anyone he'd considered making a life with. Until now. Clara had asked daringly one evening, her heart pounding as the words left her lips. Grant had looked at her steadily, his eyes reflecting the last light of day. Until now, he'd confirmed softly. By mid-July, the first new flower beds were planted, the small house was habitable, and Grant had hired a local woman named Martha to help with cutting and arranging. Clara had introduced him to Mrs. Wilson, the doctor's wife, who had connections with ladies' societies in Milwaukee and had agreed to help secure their first larger orders. Eleanor watched these developments with quiet satisfaction, though Clara noticed her mother seemed to be growing weaker as summer progressed. Dr. Wilson visited more frequently, his expression increasingly grave as he left their home. When Clara questioned him privately, he merely patted her hand and advised her to make the most of the time you have left, my dear. On a warm evening in late July, as Clara and Grant sat on her porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering darkness, Grant suddenly took her hand in his. "Clara," he said, his voice unusually solemn, "there's something I need to ask you." Clara's heart quickened. They had grown closer over the past weeks, but neither had spoken openly of their feelings beyond that one exchange. "Yes." Grant turned to face her fully, still holding her hand. "I've come to care for you more deeply than I ever thought possible in such a short time. I hope that you might feel something similar for me." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. Grant's face relaxed slightly. "I need to return to Montana soon. My foreman has been managing things in my absence, but there are matters that require my personal attention." Clara felt a chill despite the warm night. "How long will you be gone?" "A month, perhaps 2, Grant replied. "And that's what I wanted to ask you about." He took a deep breath. "I'd like you to consider coming with me." Clara stared at him, startled. "To Montana, but the business, my mother." Grant squeezed her hand gently. "Not permanently, at least not yet, just for a visit. Martha and the men can manage the work here for a few weeks, and—" he hesitated. "I've spoken with Dr. Wilson about your mother. He believes the trip would be too taxing for her, but he also thinks she's stable enough to be left in good hands for a short time. Mrs. Wilson has offered to stay with her." Clara was speechless. The idea of traveling so far, of seeing the mountains and valleys Grant had described so vividly, was thrilling. But leaving her mother, even in capable hands. "I know it's a lot to consider," Grant continued, "and I want you to understand my intentions clearly." His expression grew even more serious. "I'm asking you to come to Montana because I want you to see my home, to meet my friends and neighbors, to understand that part of my life. But I'm also asking because I hope," he faltered slightly. "I hope that someday you might consider making it your home as well, with me, as my wife." The last words hung in the air between them, not quite a proposal but a clear statement of intent. Clara felt dizzy with emotion. "Grant, she began, but he shook his head. "Don't answer now," he said gently. "Think about it, talk to your mother, I'll respect whatever decision you make." Clara nodded, grateful for his understanding. "When would we leave?" "Next week, if possible," Grant replied. "We'd take the train to Cheyenne, then a stage coach the rest of the way." Clara tried to imagine herself on such a journey farther from home than she'd ever been. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. "I'll give you my answer tomorrow," she promised. Grant smiled, raising her hand to his lips. "That's all I ask." He stood to leave, pausing at the porch steps. "Good night, Clara." "Good night, Grant," she replied softly, watching as he walked away into the darkness. Inside, she found her mother still awake, sitting up in bed with a shawl around her shoulders despite the warm night. "Well?" Eleanor asked as Clara entered. "Did he ask you?" Clara's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "You knew," Eleanor smiled. "Of course I knew. He came to me first, you know, asked for my blessing." Tears pricked at Clara's eyes. "And did you give it?" "I did," Eleanor said, reaching for her daughter's hand. "With all my heart." Clara sat on the edge of the bed, conflicted. "But how can I leave you, even for a few weeks?" Eleanor's expression grew serious. "Clara, my darling girl, you've put your life on hold for me long enough. Mrs. Wilson is a kind woman and a capable nurse. I'll be perfectly fine in her care." "But no buts," Elena interrupted firmly. "I want you to go. I want you to see those mountains Grant talks about. I want you to have adventures while you're young enough to enjoy them." Her voice softened. "And I want to know that you'll have someone to take care of you when I'm gone." Clara felt tears spill onto her cheeks. "Don't talk like that, Mother. You're going to be fine." Elena reached up to wipe away her daughter's tears. "We both know that's not true, dear heart. My time is coming sooner rather than later." She took Clara's face in her hands. "Promise me you won't let fear hold you back from happiness. Promise me you'll give Grant and yourself a chance at the life you deserve." Clara couldn't speak past the lump in her throat, so she simply nodded, then leaned forward to embrace her mother, holding her fragile form close and trying to memorize the feel of her arms around her. Later that night, as Clara lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she thought about Grant's almost proposal and the journey he was suggesting. Montana seemed a world away, wild and untamed, so different from the settled communities of Wisconsin. Could she be happy there? Would she be able to adapt to such a different life? And yet, when she imagined Grant by her side, the prospect seemed less daunting. In the few short weeks they'd known each other, he had become a steadfast presence in her life, someone she trusted implicitly. The thought of a future without him now seemed strangely empty. By morning she had made her decision. When Grant arrived at 10 o'clock as promised, Clara was waiting for him on the porch, her expression serene. "Good morning," Grant greeted her, his eyes searching her face anxiously. "Did you sleep well?" Clara smiled. "Not particularly. I had a lot to think about." Grant nodded, his expression guarded. "And have you reached a decision?" "I have," Clara replied, then deliberately paused, enjoying the suspense for just a moment. "I would be honored to accompany you to Montana, Grant Mitchell." The relief and joy that flooded Grant's face was almost comical. He bounded up the porch steps in 2 strides and, before Clara could react, swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in an exuberant embrace. "Grant." Clara gasped, laughing despite herself. "Put me down this instant. What will the neighbors think?" "Let them think what they want," Grant declared, though he did set her gently back on her feet. His hands remained on her waist, keeping her close. "I'm the happiest man in Wisconsin right now, possibly in the entire United States." Clara couldn't help but smile at his enthusiasm. "It's only a visit, remember. I haven't agreed to anything more permanent yet." Grant's expression sobered slightly, though his eyes remained bright. "I understand, but I have great faith in Montana's persuasive powers." His voice dropped lower. "And in my own." The warmth in his gaze made Clara's heart flutter. She placed her hands lightly on his chest, feeling the solid strength of him beneath her palms. "I should warn you, Mr. Mitchell, I'm not easily persuaded." Grant's smile returned, slow and confident. "I welcome the challenge, Miss Stevens." He leaned closer, his intent clear. Clara's breath caught as his face neared hers. They had shared brief touches, a hand on an arm, fingers brushing while passing tools in the garden, but nothing more intimate than the chaste kiss on her cheek that first night. Now, with his lips hovering just inches from hers, Clara felt a thrill of anticipation course through her. "May I?" Grant whispered, ever respectful. In answer, Clara closed the distance between them, pressing her lips softly against his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but deepened as Grant's arms tightened around her waist, drawing her closer. Clara found herself responding with an eagerness that surprised her, her hands sliding up to his shoulders. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing more rapidly than usual. Clara felt a blush spreading across her cheeks, but she didn't look away from Grant's intense gaze. "Well," Grant said, his voice slightly hoarse, "that was worth waiting for." Clara laughed softly, feeling strangely bold and shy at the same time. Indeed it was. The door opened behind them, causing them to step apart quickly. Elena appeared, leaning heavily on her cane but smiling broadly. "I see you've given Grant your answer," she observed, her eyes twinkling. "And from the looks of things, he found it satisfactory." "Mother," Clara exclaimed, mortified. Grant, however, laughed and moved to offer Elena his arm. Your daughter has agreed to visit Montana with me, Mrs. Stevens. With your blessing, of course. You have it, Alina assured him, allowing him to escort her to her rocking chair. Though I expect you to take excellent care of her and to bring her back to me safely. You have my word, Grant promised solemnly. The week that followed was a flurry of preparation. Clara had never traveled further than Madison and had no idea what to pack for such a journey. Alina, drawing on memories of her own youthful travels, advised her on practical clothing and essential items. Grant, meanwhile, arranged their transportation and sent telegrams to his ranch, alerting his foreman to prepare for their arrival. He also spent long hours with Dr. and Mrs. Wilson, ensuring that Alina's care would be impeccable during Clara's absence. The night before their departure, Clara could hardly sleep. Excitement and anxiety warred within her as she imagined the journey ahead. What would Grant's home be like? Would his friends accept her? And most importantly, would she feel the same about him away from the familiar surroundings of Mineral Point? As dawn broke on the day of their departure, Clara rose and dressed in the practical traveling outfit. She and her mother had selected a sturdy dark blue skirt and jacket over a white shirtwaist, with a small hat secured firmly by pins. She packed the last few items in her carpet bag, then went to her mother's room. Alina was already awake, sitting up in bed with a small wooden box in her lap. "Come here, my dear," she said, patting the bed beside her. Clara sat down, noticing that her mother seemed particularly pale this morning. "Are you feeling all right? Perhaps I shouldn't go." "Nonsense," Alina interrupted. "I'm fine, just a bit tired." She handed the wooden box to Clara. "I want you to take this with you." Clara opened the box carefully. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a small gold locket on a delicate chain. She recognized it immediately. It had been her grandmother's, then her mother's, worn only on the most special occasions. "Mother, I couldn't." "You can and you will," Alina said firmly. "It's yours now, and there's something else." She reached beneath her pillow and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "This is the deed to our house and garden. I've had it transferred to your name." Clara stared at the document in shock. "But why?" "You don't need to, it's done," Alina said, her tone brooking no argument. "Whatever happens, Clara, I want you to know that you always have a home here. But I also want you to feel free to make your choices without worrying about me or this place." Clara felt tears threatening again. "I don't know what to say." Alina smiled, reaching up to touch her daughter's cheek. "Say you'll be happy, my darling. That's all I've ever wanted for you." Clara leaned forward to embrace her mother, holding her tightly. "I love you, Mother, and I love you," Alina whispered. "Now go, Grant will be waiting and Mrs. Wilson will be here any minute." With one last kiss to her mother's cheek, Clara gathered her carpet bag and the precious box containing the locket. At the door to the bedroom, she turned back for a final glance. Alina was sitting straight in her bed, her silver hair neatly braided, her expression serene. She raised her hand in farewell. "Have a wonderful adventure, my brave girl," she called. Clara nodded, unable to speak, then hurried down the stairs and out into the morning sunshine where Grant was waiting with a rented buggy to take them to the train station. The journey west was unlike anything Clara had ever experienced. The train journey from Wisconsin to Cheyenne, Wyoming territory, took 3 days, with stops in Chicago and Omaha. Grant had secured them comfortable accommodations, separate sleeping compartments, of course, with a shared sitting area where they took their meals and passed the time in conversation or reading. Clara was fascinated by the changing landscape outside the window, the endless prairies of Iowa and Nebraska, the gradual rise of the land as they approached the Rockies. Grant proved to be an excellent traveling companion, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of his previous journeys along this route. In Cheyenne, they transferred to a stagecoach for the final leg of their journey. This part was considerably less comfortable than the train, with the coach jolting over rough roads and the close quarters shared with other passengers. But even this discomfort couldn't dampen Clara's spirits, as she caught her first glimpse of the mountains Grant had described so vividly. "They're magnificent," she breathed, gazing at the distant peaks. "Like nothing I've ever seen." Grant smiled, clearly pleased by her reaction. "Wait until you see them up close. My ranch is nestled right at the foothills of a range very similar to those." After 2 days of dusty, jarring travel by stagecoach, they finally reached the small town of Pine Creek, Montana Territory. It was little more than a wide spot in the road, a general store, a saloon, a small church, and a handful of houses clustered around a single dirt street. But to Clara's surprise, their arrival caused quite a stir. As the stagecoach pulled to a stop, several people emerged from the buildings to greet them. Grant was clearly well known and respected here. Men shook his hand vigorously, women smiled and waved, and even the children seemed excited by his return. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Miss Clara Stevens," Grant announced proudly, helping Clara down from the coach. "Clara, these are my neighbors and friends." Clara found herself surrounded by friendly faces, all curious about the woman their bachelor rancher had brought home with him. There was Mrs. Hathaway, the storekeeper's wife, who immediately invited them to dinner, Mr. Jenkins, the blacksmith, who insisted on carrying Clara's bag, and several ranchers and their wives, all welcoming her with genuine warmth. "We've heard so much about your flowers, Mrs. Hathaway said, linking her arm through Clara's as they walked toward where 2 horses were waiting. "Grant sent a telegram telling us all about your garden and the new business you're starting together." Clara glanced at Grant, who looked slightly embarrassed. "I may have mentioned you a few times in my letters," he admitted. "A few," Mr. Jenkins laughed. "Every letter was Clara this and Clara that. We were beginning to think he'd invented you." Clara felt a warm glow at this evidence of Grant's feelings for her. It was one thing to be courted in her hometown, quite another to discover he had spoken of her so openly to his friends. They spent that night in the small hotel in Pine Creek, recovering from the journey. The following morning, Grant hired a wagon to transport them and Clara's belongings the final 10 miles to his ranch. As they left the town behind, the landscape opened up before them, rolling grasslands dotted with wildflowers, backed by the imposing mountains. Herds of cattle grazed in the distance, and overhead, hawks circled lazily in the clear blue sky. "It's beautiful," Clara said sincerely. "So vast and open." Grant nodded, his expression contented as he surveyed the familiar terrain. "That was my first thought when I saw it too. Like there was room to breathe out here." They crested a small rise, and suddenly the ranch came into view below them. Clara gasped. Grant had described his home, but his words hadn't done it justice. The main house was larger than she'd expected, a 2-story structure built of sturdy logs with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Several outbuildings surrounded it, a barn, bunkhouse, and what appeared to be a workshop. Behind the house, she could see a fenced garden and orchard, and beyond that, a small creek winding through a grove of cottonwood trees. "Welcome to the Triple M Ranch," Grant said, a note of pride in his voice. "What do you think?" "It's wonderful," Clara replied honestly. "I had no idea it would be so established," Grant chuckled. "Did you expect a dirt floor and a leaky roof?" Clara blushed. "No, of course not. It's really a proper home, isn't it?" "I hope it will be," Grant said softly, his eyes on her face rather than the ranch below. Before Clara could respond to this gentle hint, a rider appeared from the direction of the ranch, galloping up the road toward them. As he drew closer, Clara could see it was a young man, perhaps 18 or 19, with sandy hair and a freckled face. "That's Billy, my foreman's son," Grant explained. "Works as a wrangler for me, but he's learning the management side of things too." Billy reined his horse to a stop beside their wagon, his face split by a wide grin. "Mr. Mitchell, welcome back, sir. We weren't expecting you until tomorrow." "Made good time from Pine Creek," Grant replied, returning the smile. "Billy, this is Miss Clara Stevens, Clara Billy Thompson." "Madam," Billy said, touching the brim of his hat respectfully, "it's a real pleasure. Pa's got everything ready at the house, and Mrs. Thornton's been cooking up a storm since we got your telegram. Mrs. Thornton? Clara inquired. My housekeeper, Grant explained. She and her husband live in a small cabin just beyond the orchard. He helps with the ranch work. She keeps house and cooks. They've been with me since I first built the place. As they approached the ranch, more people appeared. The Thorntons, several cowboys from the bunkhouse, and a tall, weather-beaten man Clara assumed must be Billy's father, the foreman. Once again, she found herself warmly welcomed, though she noticed curious glances exchanged among the ranch hands when Grant wasn't looking. Mrs. Thornton, a plump, motherly woman with graying hair and kind eyes, took charge of Clara immediately. You must be exhausted from your journey, Miss Stevens. Let me show you to your room so you can freshen up before dinner. I've put you in the east bedroom. It has the best view of the mountains. The house was as impressive inside as out, simply but comfortably furnished, with polished wooden floors covered by colorful rugs. Clara's room was lovely, with a brass bed, a dresser with a mirror, and a small sitting area near the window that indeed offered a spectacular view. It's perfect, Clara told Mrs. Thornton. Thank you for going to such trouble. No trouble at all, miss, the older woman replied with a smile. It's nice to have another woman in the house. Gets lonely out here sometimes with just the men folk. After Mrs. Thornton left, Clara unpacked her few belongings, then stood at the window, taking in the panoramic vista of mountains and sky. It was so different from the familiar landscapes of Wisconsin, grander, wilder, more dramatic. She wondered if she could ever feel at home in such a place. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Grant stood there, looking slightly uncertain. Everything all right? He asked. I know it's a lot to take in. Clara smiled reassuringly. Everything is wonderful. Your home is beautiful, Grant, and your people have been so welcoming. Relief washed over his features. I'm glad. I was worried you might find it too rough compared to what you're used to. Clara laughed softly. My home is a 3-room cottage with a leaky roof. This is positively luxurious by comparison. Grant stepped into the room, leaving the door open as propriety demanded. I want you to be comfortable here, Clara, to feel at home. Anything you need, anything at all, just ask. The earnestness in his voice touched her deeply. Thank you, she said simply. They stood looking at each other for a long moment, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Finally, Grant cleared his throat. Dinner will be ready soon. I thought tomorrow I might show you around the ranch properly. And there's something special I'd like you to see if you're not too tired from the journey. I'd like that very much, Clara replied. Dinner was a lively affair, with Billy's father, Tom Thompson, joining them at the table. The conversation flowed easily, with the men sharing news of the ranch's operations and asking Clara polite questions about her journey and her flower business back in Wisconsin. Grant tells me you've got quite the eye for growing things, Tom said, passing her a plate of Mrs. Thornton's excellent biscuits. We could use someone with that talent around here. Our garden does all right, but nothing fancy, Clara smiled. I'd be happy to take a look at it while I'm here. How long will you be staying with us, Miss Stevens, Mrs. Thornton asked as she served apple pie for dessert. Clara glanced at Grant, suddenly realizing they hadn't discussed the exact length of her visit. I'm not entirely sure, she admitted. A few weeks at least. Well, you're welcome for as long as you care to stay, Mrs. Thornton said warmly, though Clara noticed another significant glance pass between her and Tom. After dinner, Grant suggested a walk to help settle their meal. The evening was warm, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine from the distant mountains. They strolled around the ranch yard, Grant pointing out various buildings and explaining their functions. You've built something really special here, Clara observed as they paused near the corral where several horses dozed in the twilight. I can see why you love it. Grant leaned against the fence, his expression thoughtful. It wasn't easy. The first few years were pretty rough, harsh winters, problems with the cattle, trouble with some of the local tribes before the treaties were signed. He glanced at her. But it's been worth every hardship. Clara stepped closer to him, drawn by the quiet passion in his voice. You belong here, she said softly. I can see that now. This land is part of you. Grant turned to face her fully. Yes, he agreed, but lately I've been thinking there's something missing. He took her hand in his. Someone missing. Clara's heart began to beat faster. Grant, I know it's too soon, he interrupted gently. I'm not asking for an answer now. I just want you to know that my feelings haven't changed. If anything, they've grown stronger since we left Wisconsin. His fingers tightened around hers. I love you, Clara Stevens. I think I started falling in love with you the moment I saw you with your flowers that first morning. The simple declaration, spoken without flourish or dramatic gesture, was somehow more powerful for its plainness. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. I think I might be falling in love with you too, she whispered. But it's all happening so fast, and there's Mother to consider and our business, and Grant silenced her with a gentle finger against her lips. I know, there's a lot to figure out. All I'm asking is that you keep an open mind while you're here. See if you could imagine a life here with me. Clara nodded, unable to speak past the emotion welling in her throat. Grant's hand moved from her lips to her cheek, cradling it tenderly as he leaned down to kiss her. Unlike their first kiss, which had been tentative and brief, this one lingered, deepening as Clara's arms wound around his neck. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. Grant rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. You're making it very hard for me to be a gentleman, Miss Stevens, he murmured. Clara laughed softly, feeling a newfound power in her effect on him. Perhaps I don't always want you to be a gentleman, Mr. Mitchell. Grant groaned, pulling back slightly to look at her with a mixture of desire and respect. Now I know you're trying to test my resolve. He reluctantly released her. We should head back before Mrs. Thornton sends out a search party. Clara nodded, though she was reluctant to end their time alone together. As they walked back toward the house, hand in hand now, she felt a strange sense of rightness, as if pieces of a puzzle were falling into place. That night, lying in the comfortable bed with the window open to the cool mountain air, Clara thought about Grant's declaration and her own confused feelings. She did love him, or was well on her way to loving him. But could she truly make a life here, so far from everything and everyone she knew? And what about her mother? Growing frailer by the day, she fell asleep with these questions still swirling in her mind, only to be awakened just after dawn by a soft knock at her door. Clara, Grant's voice called quietly, are you awake? There's something I want to show you. Quickly donning her robe over her nightgown, Clara opened the door to find Grant already dressed in riding clothes, his expression eager. Get dressed, he urged, and wear something suitable for riding. I promise it'll be worth the early hour. Intrigued, Clara hurried to comply. 20 minutes later, she joined Grant in the kitchen where Mrs. Thornton had prepared a simple breakfast of coffee, biscuits, and jam. Where are we going? Clara asked as they ate quickly. Grant's eyes twinkled. It's a surprise. But bring your shawl, it can be cool in the mountains, even in summer. Outside, 2 horses were saddled and waiting. Grant helped Clara mount a gentle mare named Daisy, then swung up onto his own stallion. They set off at an easy pace, heading away from the ranch toward the mountains that dominated the western horizon. As they rode, the sun continued to rise, casting long shadows across the grasslands and illuminating the peaks ahead with golden light. Clara found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the horses' movement, enjoying the quiet companionship and the magnificent scenery. After about an hour's ride, they entered a forested area, following a narrow trail that wound between tall pines. The air was cooler here, fragrant with the scent of pine needles and rich earth. Birds called from the branches overhead, and once Clara caught a glimpse of a deer watching them warily from a thicket. Almost there, Grant said over his shoulder. Just around this next bend. The trail curved sharply, then opened suddenly onto a small meadow nestled in a natural bowl among the trees. Clara gasped in wonder. The entire meadow was ablaze with wildflowers: purple lupine, orange paintbrush, yellow arnica, blue columbine, and dozens of other varieties she had never seen before. "Oh, Grant," she breathed, reining Daisy to a stop at the edge of the meadow. "It's incredible." Grant dismounted and came to help her down, his expression pleased by her reaction. "I discovered this place my first summer here," he said. "I try to come at least once every year when the flowers are at their peak." He took her hand, leading her into the meadow. "I've never shown it to anyone else." Clara felt honored by this admission, recognizing it as the significant gesture it was. As they walked among the flowers, Grant named the varieties he knew, while Clara identified others from her botanical knowledge. In the center of the meadow, a large boulder provided a natural seat overlooking the colorful expanse. Grant spread a small blanket he'd brought in his saddlebag, and they sat side by side, taking in the breathtaking scene. "I thought you might appreciate this more than anyone else I've ever known," Grant said quietly. "When I first saw your flower stand in Mineral Point, I was reminded of this place. There was something about the care you took with your arrangements, the way you seemed to understand each bloom's unique beauty." He trailed off, suddenly self-conscious. "I suppose that sounds foolish." "Not at all," Clara assured him, deeply moved. "It's one of the loveliest things anyone has ever said to me." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching bees and butterflies flit among the blossoms. Finally, Clara spoke. "Could we bring some seeds back? I'd love to try growing these in Wisconsin." Grant looked at her thoughtfully. "Of course, but Clara," he hesitated. "Have you given any thought to what happens after your visit? To us, I mean." Clara gazed out at the rainbow of flowers, considering her words carefully. I've thought of little else, actually." She turned to face him. "I care for you deeply, Grant. More than I thought possible in such a short time, and this place your home, it's beautiful beyond words." "But," Grant prompted gently, sensing her hesitation. "But my mother needs me," Clara said simply. "Her health is deteriorating. Dr. Wilson doesn't expect her to last the winter." Tears filled her eyes. "I can't leave her, Grant, not now." Grant took her hand, his expression understanding. "Of course you can't, I would never ask that of you." "But I don't see how we can," Clara began, but Grant interrupted. "We'll find a way," he said firmly. "If your mother's condition is as serious as you say, then clearly you need to be in Wisconsin for now. But that doesn't mean we can't make plans for the future." Clara looked at him uncertainly. "What sort of plans?" Grant shifted to face her more directly. "Clara, I intended to wait until later in your visit for this, to give you more time to get to know me and this place, but perhaps it's better to speak plainly now." He took both her hands in his. "I love you. I want to marry you. Whether that means living in Montana or Wisconsin or dividing our time between both, I don't care. I just want to be with you." Clara stared at him, her heart pounding. Is this a proposal?" Grant smiled, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a small velvet pouch. "I suppose it is, though not quite as I planned it." He opened the pouch and tipped a ring into his palm, a simple gold band set with a small, perfect diamond. "This was my mother's. I've carried it with me for years, waiting for the right woman to give it to." He looked into her eyes. "I found her selling flowers on a street corner in Mineral Point, Wisconsin." Clara felt tears spill onto her cheeks. "Grant, you don't have to answer now," he said quickly. "Take all the time you need, but I want you to have this ring as a promise of my intentions." He slipped it onto her finger where it fit as if made for her. "Whatever the future holds, Clara, I want to face it with you. If that means selling the ranch and moving to Wisconsin, I'll do it. If it means continuing our flower business there until you're ready to consider other options, that's what we'll do." Clara looked down at the ring glinting on her finger, then back at Grant's earnest face. In that moment, all her doubts and fears seemed to fall away. She knew with sudden clarity that what she felt for this man was real and lasting. "Yes," she said simply. Grant blinked in surprise. "Yes," Clara laughed through her tears. "Yes, I'll marry you, Grant Mitchell. I love you and I want to be your wife." For a moment, Grant seemed stunned. Then his face broke into a smile of such pure joy that it took Clara's breath away. He pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that left her dizzy. When they finally broke apart, both laughing and crying at once, Grant cradled her face in his hands. "You've made me the happiest man alive," he said hoarsely. "But are you sure? What about your mother, the business? We'll work it out," Clara said confidently. "Together. As you said, perhaps we can divide our time between both places. The flower business can continue in Wisconsin with Martha's help, and I can start a garden here too." She glanced around at the meadow. "There's clearly no shortage of inspiration." Grant kissed her again, more gently this time. "When?" he asked. "When will you marry me?" Clara considered the question. "I'd like to return to Wisconsin first to see Mother and make sure she's all right, and to tell her in person she'll be so happy, Grant. She's quite taken with you." "The feeling is mutual," Grant assured her. "Your mother is a remarkable woman. I see where you get your strength and grace." They spent the rest of the morning in the meadow, making plans and gathering seeds from the wildflowers. By the time they mounted their horses for the return journey, Clara felt as if she were floating, her heart so full of joy it might burst. The news of their engagement was received with delighted approval by everyone at the ranch. Mrs. Thornton insisted on preparing a special dinner to celebrate, and Tom Thompson opened a bottle of fine whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion. Even the cowboys from the bunkhouse offered their congratulations, though Clara noticed with amusement that several seemed disappointed that their boss was officially off the market. The remaining 2 weeks of Clara's visit passed in a blur of activity and discovery. Grant showed her every aspect of the ranch operations, from the cattle herds to the hay fields to the small-scale logging operation in the forested areas of his property. Clara, in turn, spent time in the garden with Mrs. Thornton, sharing her knowledge of flowers and vegetables. In the evenings, they often sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in spectacular colors, discussing their future together. They decided that after their wedding, they would spend summers and falls in Montana, when the ranch required the most attention, and winters and springs in Wisconsin, allowing them to prepare for the flower-growing season and care for Alina. "It won't be easy," Grant acknowledged one evening as they watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "Traveling back and forth, maintaining homes in both places, but I think it could work." Clara, leaning against his shoulder, nodded. "I do too. And in time, perhaps we might settle more permanently in one place or the other." She glanced up at him. "I've grown quite fond of your Montana, Grant Mitchell. I could imagine making a life here someday." Grant's arm tightened around her. "That means more to me than I can say." As their departure date approached, Clara found herself increasingly torn. She missed her mother and worried about her health, but she had also fallen in love with Montana, its vast skies, its dramatic landscapes, and the simpler rhythm of life on the ranch. On their last evening, Grant took her to a high point on his property that offered a panoramic view of the entire valley. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the grasslands and turning the distant mountains purple, he held her close. "It won't be goodbye for long," he promised. "I'll follow you to Wisconsin within a month, just enough time to get things organized here so Tom can manage in my absence." Clara nodded, blinking back tears. "I know, it's silly to be sad when I'll see you so soon." "Not silly at all," Grant assured her, kissing the top of her head. "I'll miss you every minute we're apart." The journey back to Wisconsin seemed twice as long as the journey west had been. Despite the comfort of the train and Grant's attentive companionship, Clara was impatient to reach home, to see her mother, to share her news and her experiences. As they approached Mineral Point, Clara felt a strange mix of emotions: happiness at returning home, excitement about her engagement, but also a lurking apprehension about her mother's health. Grant, sensing her anxiety, held her hand tightly as the train pulled into the station. "Whatever happens," he promised, "we'll face it together." Dr. Wilson was waiting for them on the platform, his expression grave. Clara's heart sank at the sight of him. "Clara," he said, taking her hands as she descended from the train, "I'm glad you're back. Your mother has been asking for you." "How is she?" Clara asked, fear clutching at her throat. The doctor's eyes were kind but somber. Not well, my dear. She's been failing rapidly these past few days. Mrs. Wilson is with her now, but— He trailed off, the implication clear. Grant stepped forward, his hand steady on Clara's back. I've hired a wagon, he said. It's waiting outside. We can go directly to your home. The journey from the station to the Stevens cottage seemed endless. Clara sat rigid with anxiety, clutching Grant's hand. When they finally arrived, she leapt from the wagon before it had fully stopped, rushing up the path to the front door. Mrs. Wilson met her in the hallway, her expression sympathetic. She's awake, dear, she said softly. She's been so determined to hold on until you returned. Clara hurried to her mother's bedroom, Grant following close behind. Elinor lay propped up on pillows, her face paper white against the bedclothes, her breathing shallow and labored, but her eyes brightened as Clara entered. There you are, she whispered, raising a trembling hand. My beautiful girl, I was beginning to think I might miss saying goodbye. Mother, Clara choked, sinking to her knees beside the bed and taking the frail hand in hers. I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere. Elinor's gaze moved past Clara to where Grant stood in the doorway. Grant, she called weakly, come in, my dear boy. Grant approached the bed, his hat in his hands, his expression solemn. Mrs. Stevens, he greeted her gently. Elinor looked from Grant to Clara, her eyes sharp despite her obvious weakness. Well, she prompted. Am I to have good news before I go? Clara exchanged a glance with Grant, then held up her left hand, showing the ring that sparkled there. The best news, she confirmed. Grant has asked me to be his wife, and I've accepted. A smile transformed Elinor's pale face. Thank God, she whispered. That's all I wanted to know. She beckoned Grant closer. You'll take care of her, with my life, Grant promised solemnly. Elinor nodded, satisfied. And you, daughter, did you find what you were looking for in Montana? Clara smiled through her tears. I found more than I ever dreamed possible, Mother. It's beautiful there, you would love it, and Grant's home is wonderful. She squeezed her mother's hand. But we'll be living here too, part of the year. We've worked it all out. Elinor's eyes began to drift closed, her energy clearly flagging. Good, she murmured. That's good, the garden, it should stay in the family. It will, Clara assured her, and we'll expand it just as we planned. Stevens and Mitchell Florals will become the finest flower business in Wisconsin, maybe even beyond. A faint smile touched Elinor's lips. My clever girl, she whispered. Always knew you were destined for more than Mineral Point could offer. Her eyes fluttered open once more, fixing on Clara's face. Be happy, my darling, that's all that matters in the end. Clara leaned forward to kiss her mother's cheek. I will be, Mother. I promise. Elinor nodded slightly, then her eyes closed again. Her breathing seemed to ease somewhat, as if a great burden had been lifted from her. I think I'll rest now, she murmured. Clara remained by the bedside, holding her mother's hand as Elinor drifted into sleep. Grant pulled a chair close, sitting beside Clara in silent support. Hours passed, with Dr. Wilson checking in periodically. As night fell, Elinor's breathing became more labored, then gradually, almost imperceptibly, slowed and finally stopped altogether. She's gone, Dr. Wilson said softly, checking for a pulse. It was very peaceful, Clara. No pain. Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. Grant's arm came around her shoulders, holding her steady as grief washed over her. They sat together in the quiet room for a long time, Clara clinging to Grant's strength as she said her final goodbye to the woman who had been her whole world for so long. The days that followed passed in a blur of funeral arrangements, condolence calls, and practical matters that needed attention. Through it all, Grant remained by Clara's side, quietly supportive, taking on whatever tasks he could to ease her burden. The people of Mineral Point, who had always been kind to the Stevens women, rallied around Clara with food, assistance, and comfort. A week after Elinor's passing, as they sat on the porch of the cottage in the cool evening air, Grant took Clara's hand. We don't have to make any decisions right away, he said gently. About the wedding or where we'll live or anything else, take all the time you need to grieve. Clara looked out at the garden, now in full summer bloom, her mother's legacy, vibrant with life even as its creator was gone. "Mother wouldn't want me to wait," she said finally. "She was so happy about our engagement, she'd want us to go forward with our plans." Grant squeezed her hand. "Are you sure? There's no rush, Clara." Clara turned to him, suddenly certain. "I'm sure. Life is too short and too precious to delay happiness when you've found it." She managed a small smile. "Besides, we have a flower business to build, remember?" Grant's eyes crinkled at the corners. "I remember. Speaking of which, I checked on the property today. The repairs to the house are coming along well, and the first few acres have been plowed and prepared for planting." Clara nodded. She had been so consumed by grief that she had barely thought about their business plans. "That's good. We should be able to plant some fall bulbs soon and prepare for a proper spring garden." They fell silent for a while, watching as fireflies began to appear in the gathering dusk. Finally, Clara spoke again. "I'd like a small wedding," she said. "Here in Mineral Point before the first snow. Just close friends, and then we can travel to Montana for the winter if that suits your plans." Grant studied her face. "Are you certain? Winter in Montana can be harsh, especially for someone not accustomed to it." Clara smiled, more genuinely this time. "I'm certain. I want to see those mountains covered in snow. I want to experience every season in both of our homes." She leaned against his shoulder. "Besides, it will give me time to plan a proper flower garden for your ranch come spring." Grant chuckled, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Our ranch," he corrected gently. "And I have no doubt it will be the most beautiful garden Montana territory has ever seen." 6 weeks later, on a crisp October morning, Clara Stevens became Clara Mitchell in a simple ceremony held in the garden she had inherited from her mother. Dr. and Mrs. Wilson stood as witnesses, along with Martha and several other close friends from Mineral Point. Clara wore a dress of pale blue silk, a wedding gift from Grant, with her mother's locket around her neck, and a crown of late blooming flowers in her hair. Grant, handsome in a new suit, watched his bride approach with an expression of such adoration that several of the ladies present dabbed at their eyes before the ceremony even began. The local minister, who had known Clara since childhood, performed the service with genuine warmth, adding a special prayer for Alina's spirit to witness her daughter's joy. After the ceremony, a small reception was held in the cottage, with food prepared by the women of the town and music provided by Mr. Jenkins, who proved to be a talented fiddler. As twilight approached, the newlyweds slipped away to the train station, bound for Montana and the beginning of their life together. On the train platform, Clara turned for one last look at the town that had been her home for all of her 22 years. The afternoon sun gilded the limestone buildings with golden light, and in the distance, she could just make out the spire of the church where her parents had been married and where her mother had been laid to rest. "Having second thoughts?" Grant asked softly, following her gaze. Clara shook her head, turning back to her husband with a smile. "Not at all, just saying goodbye for now, not forever." She took his arm as the train whistle sounded. "Let's go home, Grant." "Which one?" he teased, helping her up the steps. Clara's laugh drifted back along the platform. "Both of them, all of them. Wherever we're together, that's home." As the train pulled away from Mineral Point, carrying Clara toward her new life in the West, she thought about the strange series of events that had brought her to this moment. A cowboy passing through town, a garden full of flowers, a generous gesture that had blossomed into love. Life's path was unpredictable, full of unexpected turns and crossroads. But sometimes, if you were very lucky, those turns led exactly where you were meant to be all along. 5 years later, Clara stood in the magnificent greenhouse Grant had built for her on their Montana ranch, carefully tending the exotic orchids she had recently acquired from a botanical garden in San Francisco. Outside, the mountains were dusted with the first snow of the season, but inside the glass structure, it was warm and humid, filled with the scent of rich earth and blooming flowers. The sound of laughter drew her attention to the far end of the greenhouse, where 4-year-old Alina, named for her grandmother, was helping 3-year-old James water the seedlings with varying degrees of success. Their father knelt beside them, gently guiding their small hands to pour just the right amount from the watering can. Clara smiled at the sight of her family, her tall, strong husband with his dark hair now touched with silver at the temples, and their 2 beautiful children, both with their father's gray eyes and their mother's honey-brown hair. In the 5 years since their wedding, Stevens and Mitchell florals had flourished beyond their wildest expectations, with gardens in both Wisconsin and Montana, and regular shipments to cities as far away as Chicago and Denver. "Mama, look." Eleanor called, holding up a pot where the first green shoots of spring bulbs were beginning to emerge. "They're growing." "Yes, they are," Clara agreed, moving to join her family. "Just like you." Grant looked up at his wife, his eyes still holding the same warmth and admiration they had when he first saw her selling flowers on a street corner in Mineral Point. "I was just telling the children about how we met," he said, standing to wrap an arm around her waist. "About the cowboy who bought an entire garden from the prettiest flower seller in Wisconsin." Clara laughed, leaning into his embrace. "You make it sound like a fairy tale, isn't it?" Grant asked softly, pressing a kiss to her temple. "The best kind of fairy tale, the one that comes true." As their children scampered off to explore other parts of the greenhouse, Grant turned Clara in his arms to face him fully. "Happy anniversary, Mrs. Mitchell," he murmured, lowering his lips to hers in a kiss that, even after 5 years of marriage, still made her heart race. When they broke apart, Clara rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Happy anniversary," she whispered back. "Thank you for my garden, Grant, for both of them." Grant's arms tightened around her. "Thank you for making them bloom," he replied. "And for giving me so much more than flowers." Outside, the first snowflakes of winter danced in the mountain air, while inside the greenhouse, surrounded by the vibrant life they had cultivated together, Clara and Grant Mitchell held each other close, secure in the knowledge that their love, like the most carefully tended garden, would continue to grow and flourish through all the seasons of their lives.